The apple orchard looked perfect from the road. White and pale pink blossoms covered the branches. Dew rested on the grass. The first sunlight moved over the tops of the trees, warming one row at a time. But 12-year-old Caleb Green was not looking at the color. He was listening. The orchard was almost silent. Caleb stood beneath a young apple tree with a small notebook in one hand and an old kitchen timer in the other. He watched one marked branch and counted every insect that landed on the flowers. For several minutes, nothing came. Then a small native bee entered the tree, crawled across 2 blossoms, and disappeared toward the barn. Caleb stopped the timer. One visitor. He moved to the next tree and began again. Between several orchard rows stretched narrow strips of yellow, white, and violet flowers. Some were fully open. Others still held tight buds. Small wooden stakes marked the boundaries so the family mower would not cut through them. A few insects moved among the low flowers. None of them had reached the nearest apple tree yet. Caleb's father, Marcus Green, opened one apple blossom carefully and examined the center. The previous spring, the orchard had produced thousands of flowers but far fewer apples than the family expected. Many blossoms had simply dried and fallen. The trees had looked full. The harvest had not. Now another cool week had arrived during bloom. If too few pollinators moved between the flowers, the same thing could happen again. Caleb watched a bee circle the flower strip. It landed on a yellow bloom, moved to another, and remained close to the ground. If the insect stayed there, his experiment would not help the apple trees. If cold wind kept them from flying at all, 5 months of work might end with another quiet orchard and another disappointing harvest. Before we return to the beginning, subscribe if you enjoy stories about observant people who test small ideas before everyone else sees the problem. 5 months earlier, the Green family orchard outside Chestertown in Kent County, Maryland, had already finished its harvest. Marcus and his wife, Denise, sold apples from a small roadside stand and supplied a few local stores. The orchard was not large enough to support expensive equipment or rented commercial bee colonies every season. The previous spring had begun with heavy bloom. Marcus had expected a strong crop. But as summer progressed, the fruit count remained low. Caleb remembered something others had not noticed. During the most important days of flowering, the orchard had been strangely empty of bees. The ground beneath the trees was mowed short. Almost nothing else bloomed nearby. Before the apple flowers opened, there was little food to bring pollinators into the orchard. After the petals fell, there was little reason for them to remain. That autumn, Caleb began collecting seeds from native plants growing along a neglected pasture edge. When he marked several narrow strips between the apple rows, his older sister looked at the bare soil and laughed. "You know we sell apples," she said, "not bouquets." A neighboring grower stopped near the fence and asked whether the Green family was turning the orchard into a flower garden. Caleb did not argue. He asked his father to leave him only 3 short strips. The nearby rows without flowers would remain unchanged. If Caleb's idea failed, most of the orchard would be untouched. Caleb's idea had begun near an abandoned pasture. Late in summer, the pasture edge was filled with small yellow, white, and purple flowers. Even during the hottest part of the afternoon, insects moved constantly above them. Bumblebees pushed into deep blossoms. Small native bees crossed the flatter flowers. Hoverflies and butterflies moved between plants that opened at different times. The orchard looked different. Outside the brief apple bloom, it offered almost nothing. Caleb began to understand that pollinators could not be expected to wait beside trees that fed them for only a short part of the year. The orchard needed to become useful before the apple blossoms opened, and wide plantings would compete with the trees for water, interfere with mowing, and require more labor than the family could provide. He wanted narrow strips with several flowering periods. Some plants would open early. Others would bloom alongside the apples. Later species would continue feeding insects after the orchard petals disappeared. With help from his grandmother, Caleb sorted the collected seeds into plain paper packets. He selected local plants rather than ornamental species that might spread beyond the intended area. In early spring, he loosened 3 narrow sections of soil between selected apple rows. He kept the strips away from the trunks and left enough space for the mower and harvest cart. Marcus helped him mark several experimental trees and several control trees of similar age and size. Caleb planned to observe each group for the same amount of time. He would count visits to marked branches during similar weather conditions. Later, the family would compare the number of young fruitlets that remained after petal fall. Marcus approved of the comparison but warned his son about an easy mistake. Bees on the ground flowers are not the same as bees in the apple trees, he said. Caleb nodded. Attracting insects to the farm was only the first step. They also needed to move from the flower strips into the orchard canopy. The first seedlings appeared as thin green lines. They looked unimpressive. Some were so small that even Caleb had trouble separating them from weeds. The neighboring grower returned and looked across the field. "Those stakes are growing better than the flowers," he said. Caleb smiled faintly and continued watering the young plants. He believed time would solve the problem. Instead, time exposed the biggest mistake in his plan. As the apple buds began swelling, most of Caleb's flowers remained green. They were alive. They were healthy. And they were going to bloom too late. A warm spell arrived in early spring. For several afternoons, the temperature rose quickly. The apple buds developed faster than anyone expected, and pale petals began showing between the protective scales. Caleb walked to the flower strips each morning. Most of the plants had not formed buds. He had chosen species from photographs and general flowering guides, but he had not paid enough attention to how local weather and planting time would affect them in eastern Maryland. Many would bloom after the apple petals had already fallen. They might help insects later in the year. They could do almost nothing for the coming apple bloom. The second problem was visible in the widest strip. Caleb had not removed enough grass before sowing. Fast-growing weeds and pasture grass were beginning to shade the flower seedlings. In some places, the plants he wanted were nearly invisible beneath taller growth. The third strip had been covered with too much straw. Caleb had worried that birds would eat the seed, so he protected the soil with a thick layer. After several rains, the straw flattened into a wet mat. Some seedlings could not reach the light. Marcus walked the 3 strips with him. "So far," he said, "the grass is winning." Caleb looked toward the swelling apple buds. He could not wait for the next season. The orchard would bloom within weeks. He removed most of the straw by hand and thinned the aggressive grass around the surviving seedlings. But those plants would still flower too late. Caleb needed an early blooming group that was already established. On another part of the family property, several native spring flowers grew near a fence line scheduled for clearing. With his father's permission, Caleb moved a limited number of those plants into one short experimental strip. He did not disturb protected land or collect plants from public property. The transplanted flowers had already developed roots and early buds. Caleb reduced the width of the strip and left bare space around the apple trunks. Marcus installed low wooden markers so the mower could pass without destroying the planting. The redesigned area looked less ambitious. It also had a chance of blooming at the right time. Within several weeks, the first early flowers opened. A few small bees appeared during sunny afternoons. Caleb watched them feed close to the ground while the apple buds remained closed above. The timing was closer now. But another problem approached. The weather forecast showed cool clouds, wind, and rain during the exact period when the apple flowers were expected to open. Even a perfectly designed flower strip could not force insects to fly in bad weather. Caleb had corrected the planting. Now he needed a short window of warmth. The first apple flowers opened after one unusually warm afternoon. By the next morning, the temperature had fallen. Clouds covered the sky, and a cold breeze moved between the orchard rows. The branches were full of blossoms, but there was almost no insect activity. Caleb began his first timed observation at a control tree. No bee visited the marked branch. He moved to another control tree. Again, nothing. Near the repaired flower strip, a few insects remained hidden inside low blossoms, protected partly from the wind. They were present. They were not flying. Then the sun appeared through a narrow break in the clouds. The temperature rose slightly. One small bee left a yellow flower and crossed toward the nearest apple tree. Caleb followed it with his eyes until it entered the lower branches. Another insect rose from the strip several minutes later. For a short period, the orchard began to make the sound Caleb had been waiting for. Not a loud hum. Only scattered movement. The effect was strongest near the early flower strip. Trees farther away received few visits. On some nearby branches, insects continued feeding below and never moved into the apples. Caleb could not direct them. He could only record what they chose to do. The following day brought rain. Water struck the blossoms and damaged some petals. Pollinator activity nearly disappeared again. Caleb worried that the useful window would close before enough flowers were visited. Then the rain stopped near midday. A few warm hours followed. The early strip became active almost immediately. Small native bees, hoverflies, several bumblebees, and other insects moved between the low flowers. Some crossed into the nearest apple trees. The control trees also received visits, but less often during Caleb's timed observations. He repeated the counts on different branches and different days. The pattern remained moderate rather than dramatic. The flower strip increased activity near the closest trees. It did not transform the entire orchard. The wider failed strip remained almost useless during apple bloom. Its plants had not opened yet. The late flowering section attracted no meaningful activity at the moment when the apple trees needed it most. By the end of the week, petals covered the grass beneath every row. From a distance, the experimental and control trees looked the same. A visited blossom did not announce whether it had been pollinated. A silent blossom did not immediately show failure. The family had to wait. The answer would appear only after the petals were gone. Several weeks later, Caleb and Marcus returned to the marked branches. The blossoms had disappeared. In their place, some stems held tiny green fruitlets no larger than marbles. Other stems had dried and fallen away. Caleb counted each remaining fruit on the comparison branches. The trees nearest the successful early flower strip held more young apples than the matching control trees. The difference was real. It was not enormous. The trees farther from the strip showed little improvement. The wide strip overrun by grass had produced no useful result during bloom. Most of Caleb's original flower mixture opened too late to affect that season's apple set. The successful section worked because the right plants flowered at the right time and stood close enough to the orchard trees. Even there, weather had limited the number of visits. Marcus and Caleb continued observing the fruit through summer. Some young apples dropped naturally. Others were removed during thinning so the branches would not carry more fruit than they could. The flower strip did not protect the crop from every problem. At harvest, the family collected apples from the experimental and control trees separately. The closest trees beside the well-timed strip produced a modestly higher marketable crop. It was not a record harvest. It did not make the family wealthy, but it confirmed that a narrow strip could improve pollinator activity when its plants were selected and timed carefully. Marcus looked at the separate crates near the packing shed. "Which flowers opened before the apples?" he asked. Caleb showed him the plants and his records. "And which ones were too late?" Caleb pointed toward the wider strip, now finally full of color. Marcus nodded. "Save seed from the early ones." That was his quiet recognition. The neighboring grower stopped again later that autumn. He did not ask whether the Greens planned to sell bouquets. He asked why Caleb intended to keep one strip and rebuild the others. Caleb explained the limitations honestly. Flowers did not guarantee that bees would arrive. The wrong plants could bloom too late. Wide strips could interfere with equipment or compete for moisture. Aggressive species might spread beyond their boundaries. New plantings required weeding, careful mowing,